They stopped him at the door because they thought he was a delivery driver. The glass doors of Hawthorne Dynamics headquarters slid open with a quiet mechanical hum as Marcus Reed stepped in the marble lobby carrying a worn leather briefcase that had seen better years. The building stood in the heart of downtown Charlotte, a towering structure of steel and reflective glass that caught the early morning sunlight like a blade. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of polished stone and fresh coffee drifting from a cafe near the reception desk. Executives in tailored suits crossed the floor with confident strides, their voices low, their eyes fixed on glowing phone screens. Marcus walked calmly toward the security desk, his shoes tapping softly against the polished marble. He wore a simple navy suit that fit well, but lacked the shine and prestige of the expensive brand surrounding him. His expression remained steady, thoughtful, almost peaceful, as if he had already lived through storms far greater than a skeptical glance. Before he could reach the elevator bank, a firm voice cut through the quiet rhythm of the lobby. "Hold on right there." Marcus slowed and turned his head slightly. The security guard behind the desk leaned forward in his chair, studying him with narrowed eyes. His name tag read Carl Benson. Carl gestured toward the briefcase in Marcus' hand. "Deliveries go through the service entrance around back." Marcus paused for a moment, the kind of pause that made nearby footsteps slow and conversations fade. A few employees walking past turned their heads, curious. Marcus answered calmly, his voice quiet but clear. "I'm not making a delivery." Carl raised an eyebrow and leaned back in his chair, clearly unconvinced. "Then you're in the wrong place. The corporate offices are upstairs. Appointment only." Marcus did not argue. He simply stood there for a second, looking around the bright lobby as if memorizing the room. The tall windows allowed the morning light to spill across the marble floor in wide golden rectangles. People continued walking, but now several of them glanced over with subtle curiosity. Something about the calm way Marcus carried himself made the moment stretch longer than it should have. Carl tapped his desk impatiently. "Sir, you cannot just stand here. If you're looking for work, Human Resources opens at 9 o'clock, and the hiring line forms outside." Marcus shifted his briefcase slightly in his hand, then looked back toward the elevator doors that stood silent at the far end of the lobby. For a brief moment, his reflection appeared in the mirrored surface of the steel doors. A man who had traveled a long road to reach this building. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Marcus turned back toward the guard with the same calm expression. "I'm here for a meeting." Carl let out a short laugh under his breath and shook his head slowly, the way someone does when they believe they have already figured out the situation. The morning rush continued around them, but the quiet tension near the security desk had begun to pull attention like gravity. Carl folded his arms across his chest and spoke a little louder this time, making sure the nearby employees could hear. "Sir, I do not know who you think you're meeting, but executives do not schedule meetings with people who walk in like this." A young receptionist at the front desk glanced up from her computer screen, watching the exchange with growing curiosity. Marcus remained still, his eyes steady, his breathing slow and controlled. He had stood in rooms filled with far more pressure than this lobby. Still, Carl pushed his chair back and stood, stepping around the desk as if preparing to escort Marcus toward the exit. "I'm going to need you to leave the building." Marcus looked at the guard for a long moment. Then he said something that made the receptionist freeze and the nearby conversations fall suddenly quiet. "I think you might want to check the board meeting schedule before you ask me to leave." The lobby fell into a strange silence after Marcus Reed finished speaking. The words he had just said lingered in the air like a sudden drop in temperature. Carl Benson stared at him for a moment, unsure whether to laugh again or call for backup. The guard shifted his weight and crossed his arms, trying to maintain the authority he felt was slipping from his grasp. Around them, the normal rhythm of the morning slowed. A pair of young analysts walking toward the elevators paused mid-step. One of them whispered something to the other, and both looked toward Marcus with curiosity that was growing harder to hide. Carl cleared his throat and forced a short laugh that sounded more defensive than confident. You think you're on the board meeting schedule. Is that what you're saying? Marcus held the briefcase calmly at his side. I believe you should confirm it before asking me to leave. Carl shook his head and glanced toward the reception desk, as if searching for silent support. The young receptionist named Emily Dawson had stopped typing on her keyboard several seconds earlier. She had been watching the exchange carefully, not because she enjoyed the tension, but because something about Marcus Reed did not fit the usual pattern of people who wandered into the lobby without permission. Most people who were lost looked nervous or impatient. Marcus looked neither. He stood with the quiet patience of someone who had already waded through much harder moments in life. Carl tapped the security desk with his knuckles and leaned forward slightly. Listen carefully, sir. Every executive meeting in this building has clearance lists. The board meeting upstairs is private. The only people walking through those elevators today are directors and senior officers of the company. Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the explanation without any hint of offense. That is exactly why I am here. Carl exhaled through his nose and shook his head again. The answer sounded rehearsed to him, like something someone might say when trying to bluff their way past security. Behind Marcus, the lobby doors opened again and another wave of employees entered the building. The hum of conversation rose briefly, then softened again as several people noticed the growing standoff near the security desk. One man in a gray suit slowed his pace just enough to watch while pretending to read a message on his phone. Emily Dawson finally stood from her chair and walked a few steps closer to the desk, her curiosity outweighing the instinct to stay out of security matters. Carl noticed her movement and frowned slightly. Emily, you can go back to the desk. I have this handled. She hesitated for a moment before answering softly. I was just wondering if maybe we should check the meeting schedule. Carl turned his head slowly and gave her a look that suggested the situation was already decided. I know the schedule. He turned back toward Marcus and gestured toward the glass doors behind him. Now I'm going to ask you one last time to leave the building before this becomes a bigger problem than it needs to be. Marcus did not move. He glanced briefly toward the tall windows where the sunlight continued to spill across the marble floor. For a moment he seemed almost thoughtful, as if measuring the distance between this moment and another memory only he could see. Then he returned his attention to Carl and spoke in the same calm voice. I'm not here to cause a problem. I am here because I was asked to attend the board meeting this morning. Carl rubbed his temple with one hand as if the conversation was becoming a headache. That is not possible. Marcus tilted his head slightly. Why not? Carl pointed toward the elevators. Because the person attending that meeting today is the new chief executive officer of Hawthorne Dynamics. Marcus looked at the elevator doors again, their polished steel surface reflecting the lobby like a mirror. Then he said quietly, almost as if stating an obvious fact that no one else had considered yet. Yes, that is exactly who I am here to meet. For a long second, Carl Benson did not react at all. The words seemed too strange for his mind to process. Then the guard let out a sharp laugh that echoed across the polished lobby floor. The sound drew even more attention from the people walking nearby. Several employees slowed their steps openly now, no longer pretending to ignore the scene unfolding beside the security desk. Carl shook his head slowly, as if he had just heard the most ridiculous claim of the morning. You expect me to believe that you are here to meet the new chief executive officer. That is what you are saying. Marcus Reed remained still, his posture relaxed, his hands steady on the worn leather handle of his briefcase. I said that I am here for the board meeting. Carl leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into a tone that carried a mixture of impatience and disbelief. That meeting is happening on the 32nd floor in less than 15 minutes. Directors from 3 states are flying in for it. Investors are already upstairs. The new chief executive officer is arriving any minute. Marcus gave a small nod. Yes, that is correct. Carl exhaled loudly and rubbed his forehead. The calm way Marcus answered every challenge was beginning to irritate him more than an argument would have. People who were lying usually stumbled. They raised their voices. They became defensive. This man did none of those things. He simply stood there as if time itself did not worry him. Behind the desk, Emily Dawson felt a strange tension building in the air. She had worked at the reception counter for almost 2 years and had seen many awkward encounters with visitors who tried to enter the building without permission. But none of them had stood this calmly under pressure. None of them had looked at the elevators with the quiet confidence Marcus carried in his eyes. Emily glanced toward the computer screen on the desk where the daily schedule of building events remained open. She could see the entry for the board meeting highlighted on the calendar. Hawthorne Dynamics Executive Board Session. 32nd Floor Conference Hall. Arrival of new Chief Executive Officer scheduled for this morning. Her eyes moved back toward Marcus. Carl stepped closer now, lowering his voice so that only the nearby employees could hear clearly. Sir, let me explain something to you. The man who is about to become Chief Executive Officer of this company is someone the board selected after months of interviews. He is a person with a reputation across the entire industry. He is not someone who walks into the lobby carrying an old briefcase and no identification badge. Marcus listened without interrupting. When Carl finished speaking, Marcus replied quietly, I understand why you think that. Carl stared at him. Then why are you still standing here, pretending you belong in that meeting? A small murmur passed through the nearby group of employees who had gathered within polite distance. One of the analysts whispered something to his colleague while glancing at Marcus. The situation had begun to feel less like a routine security check and more like a moment that might become office gossip by the afternoon. Marcus looked around the lobby again for a brief moment. The sunlight had climbed higher now, casting bright reflections along the marble floor and the steel elevator doors. Then he returned his attention to Carl and spoke with the same steady voice he had used since the beginning. I am not pretending. Carl gave a short laugh that sounded more strained, then amused. Then prove it. Show me one piece of identification that says you belong in that meeting. Marcus did not reach for his pocket or his briefcase. Instead, he said something that made Emily Dawson straighten in surprise behind the desk. The board chairman asked me to come early this morning so we could speak privately before the meeting begins. Carl blinked once. The mention of the chairman's name shifted the mood of the room slightly. Carl crossed his arms again, trying to recover control of the situation. The chairman does not invite strangers to private conversations before board meetings. Marcus replied calmly, You are correct. That is why he invited me. Carl opened his mouth to answer, but stopped when the soft mechanical chime of the elevator echoed across the lobby. The steel doors began to slide open slowly, and every person standing near the security desk turned their head toward the sound. The elevator doors opened with a soft mechanical whisper, and the quiet tension inside the lobby shifted instantly. Several people who had been watching the exchange near the security desk turned their full attention toward the elevator bank. A tall man in a dark charcoal suit stepped out first, his silver hair neatly combed and his posture carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades making decisions that moved entire companies. William Hawthorne rarely came down to the lobby himself. When he did, the building usually fell silent without anyone needing to say a word. Carl Benson straightened immediately when he recognized him. The guard instinctively adjusted his uniform jacket and stepped back toward the security desk, as if hoping the chairman had not noticed the confrontation taking place a few feet away. Behind Hawthorne, 2 members of the board followed, speaking in low voices about the morning agenda. Their conversation slowed when they saw the small crowd gathered near the entrance. Hawthorne paused just outside the elevator doors, his eyes moving calmly across the lobby until they settled on the security desk. For a brief moment, he simply observed the scene. Marcus Reed stood near the desk, holding his briefcase. Carl stood across from him with his arms half folded in defensive authority. Several employees lingered nearby, pretending to check messages while clearly listening. Hawthorne took a slow step forward. The quiet sound of his shoes crossing the marble floor seemed louder than it should have been. Carl felt a drop of tension in his stomach. Good morning, sir, Carl said quickly, trying to sound confident. Hawthorne nodded once, but did not immediately answer. Instead, he studied the scene carefully. His eyes moved from the curious employees to the receptionist desk, where Emily Dawson stood frozen beside her computer. Then his attention settled on Marcus Reed. For a moment, the 2 men looked at one another across the open space of the lobby. Marcus gave a small, respectful nod. Hawthorne's expression shifted slightly. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. The kind of recognition that travels through a room faster than any spoken announcement. Carl noticed the look, but misread it entirely. He cleared his throat and spoke quickly, eager to show he was protecting the building from an intruder. Sir, this gentleman says he is here for the board meeting, but he cannot provide identification, and he claims the chairman invited him personally. Hawthorne kept his eyes on Marcus for another long second before finally answering. Is that so? Carl nodded firmly. Yes, sir. I was just about to escort him out, so we can clear the entrance before the chief executive officer arrives. A quiet ripple of tension moved through the nearby employees. Some of them glanced back and forth between Marcus and the chairman, as if sensing that the moment was about to turn in a direction none of them expected. Hawthorne took another step forward. The sunlight from the tall lobby windows reflected faintly across his glasses as he stopped directly in front of Marcus Reed. Carl felt suddenly unsure whether he should speak again or remain silent. Hawthorne looked at Marcus and said calmly, Mr. Reed, I was beginning to wonder if you had already gone upstairs. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Carl blinked once, then twice. Emily Dawson felt her breath catch behind the reception desk. The employees standing nearby slowly straightened as if they had just heard something important but needed a second to understand it. Marcus answered with the same calm voice he had used since walking into the building. I thought it would be polite to wait until security finished their questions. Hawthorne nodded slightly, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. That is considerate of you. Carl felt a cold realization begin to creep through his chest. He looked from Marcus to Hawthorne, then back again. Sir, Carl said slowly, you know this man. Hawthorne turned his head just enough to look at the guard. Yes. Carl Benson swallowed. The lobby felt suddenly much warmer than it had a moment earlier. Hawthorne spoke again, his voice calm, but clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. In fact, I was the one who asked him to arrive early this morning. The words settled over the lobby with a weight that no one could ignore. Carl Benson felt the blood drain slowly from his face as the meaning of William Hawthorne's statement began to sink in. For the past several minutes, he had been speaking to Marcus Reed like a trespasser who had wandered into the wrong building. Now the chairman himself was standing in front of that same man, speaking to him with quiet familiarity. Carl opened his mouth, then closed it again. The confidence he had carried only moments earlier seemed to disappear into the polished marble floor beneath his shoes. Around them, the small cluster of employees who had gathered near the security desk exchanged stunned looks. One of the analysts who had been pretending to read a message on his phone slowly lowered the device as he realized he was witnessing something that would travel through the office faster than any official announcement. Emily Dawson stood behind the reception desk with both hands resting on the counter, her eyes moving between Marcus and the chairman. She could almost feel the shift in the room. It was the kind of shift that happens when a story everyone thought they understood suddenly reveals a different ending. William Hawthorne turned slightly toward Carl, his expression calm but serious. There is no problem here, Carl. Mr. Reed was invited to attend the board meeting this morning. Carl nodded quickly, trying to recover some measure of professionalism, even as embarrassment tightened across his chest. Yes, sir. I understand now. I was only following standard security procedure. Hawthorne gave a small approving nod. And that is exactly what you should do. The guard exhaled quietly, relieved that the chairman had not sounded angry. But the relief did not last long, because Hawthorne's next words carried a tone of quiet importance that caused every nearby employee to lean closer without realizing it. I asked Mr. Reed to arrive early so we could speak before the rest of the board joins us upstairs. Carl swallowed again and glanced toward Marcus Reed. For the first time, he looked at the man, not as a stranger standing in the lobby, but as someone who clearly belonged in a room far above his own authority. Marcus simply stood there with the same steady composure he had shown since the moment he entered the building. He had not raised his voice. He had not argued. He had waited. Hawthorne gestured toward the elevator bank with a calm motion of his hand. The meeting will begin shortly. Marcus nodded respectfully. I appreciate you coming down to meet me. Hawthorne smiled faintly. I had a feeling there might be some confusion at the entrance. Carl felt those words land directly on his shoulders. He cleared his throat and straightened his posture. Mr. Reed, I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. Marcus looked at him for a moment, then gave a small nod that carried neither anger nor pride. You were doing your job. Carl blinked slightly at the simplicity of the response. It was not the reaction he had expected. Most people would have taken the moment to prove a point. Marcus did not. Hawthorne stepped toward the elevator and pressed the call button. The polished steel doors reflected the entire scene like a silent mirror. The chairman looked back at Marcus again. It has been a long road to this morning, has it not? Marcus answered quietly. Yes, sir. Longer than most people here might imagine. Hawthorne nodded once more, understanding passing silently between the two men. The elevator chimed softly as the doors opened again. Hawthorne stepped inside and turned toward Marcus. Shall we? Marcus picked up his briefcase and walked toward the elevator. As he passed the security desk, the employees standing nearby instinctively stepped aside, giving him space. Carl watched him go with a growing sense that the moment would stay with him for the rest of his career. Just before the elevator doors began to close, Hawthorne spoke again, his voice calm, but loud enough for those still standing in the lobby to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, the board of Hawthorne Dynamics has waited many months for this day. He paused briefly, then looked toward Marcus Reed, standing beside him inside the elevator. Our new chief executive officer has finally arrived. The elevator doors closed. Softly, and the quiet hum of the motor carried Marcus Reed and William Hawthorne upward through the glass tower. For a moment, neither man spoke. The polished steel walls reflected the morning light and the faint movement of the city far below. Marcus stood with his briefcase resting lightly against his leg, while Hawthorne watched the numbers above the door slowly change as the elevator climbed. After several seconds, Hawthorne finally broke the silence. I apologize for the scene in the lobby. Marcus shook his head gently. There is no need to apologize. Your security guard was doing what he believed was right. Hawthorne gave a thoughtful nod. True. Still, the first day in a new position should begin with a little less drama. Marcus allowed a faint smile to appear. I have learned that the first day of anything important rarely begins the way people expect. The elevator continued its steady rise. Through the glass wall behind them, the skyline of Charlotte stretched across the horizon in bright morning light. Hawthorne folded his hands loosely in front of him and studied Marcus for a moment. When the board began searching for a new chief executive officer, they expected someone with a long public reputation. Someone whose name appeared regularly in financial news reports. Marcus looked forward calmly. Instead, you chose someone most of them have never heard of. Hawthorne nodded. Exactly. Some members of the board are still wondering why. Marcus did not seem surprised by that. Change makes people uncomfortable, especially in a company this size. Hawthorne gave a small approving smile. That is precisely why we need you here. The elevator chimed softly as it passed another floor. Hawthorne continued speaking. Hawthorne Dynamics has spent the last several years growing faster than our leadership structure could manage. Profits looked impressive on paper, but the culture inside the company slowly lost direction. Departments stopped communicating. Innovation slowed. Too many executives became more concerned with protecting their own positions than building something meaningful. Marcus listened carefully without interrupting. Hawthorne glanced at him again. Then we saw what you did in Denver. Marcus' eyes shifted slightly, but he remained quiet. Hawthorne continued. You took a failing manufacturing division that everyone else had already written off. Within 3 years, it became one of the most efficient operations in the region. Not because you forced people to work harder, because you listened to them. Marcus answered quietly. Most problems inside companies begin when leadership stops listening. Hawthorne nodded again. That is why the board paid attention. Several of the directors believed the company needed a leader who understands how people think on the ground level instead of someone who only studies numbers from a corner office. The elevator continued climbing toward the upper floors. Marcus looked at the glowing floor indicator above the door for a moment before speaking again. And the board agreed on that decision. Hawthorne let out a soft breath. Not all of them. Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly. Hawthorne explained. Some directors still believe the company should have chosen a more traditional candidate. Someone who looks like the executives they have always worked with. Marcus understood the meaning behind those words without needing further explanation. He had heard variations of the same concern many times throughout his career. Hawthorne continued in a steady voice. That is why this meeting today will matter. The board will see you for the first time as their chief executive officer. Marcus nodded slowly, and some of them will already be questioning whether they made the right decision. Hawthorne met his eyes directly. They will not be questioning for long if you do what you have always done. Marcus' expression remained calm. Which is what exactly? Hawthorne smiled faintly. Lead with the same quiet confidence you showed in that lobby downstairs. At that moment, the elevator slowed, and the doors began to open onto the executive floor where the board of Hawthorne Dynamics was already gathering. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor with a quiet mechanical glide, and the atmosphere outside felt completely different from the busy lobby far below. The hallway was wide and silent, lined with dark walnut panels and large framed photographs showing the history of Hawthorne Dynamics from its earliest factory days to the towering technology company it had become. Soft recessed lighting reflected along the polished floor as William Hawthorne stepped out first, and Marcus Reed followed beside him, carrying the same worn leather briefcase that had traveled with him through years of work most executives inside this building had never experienced. At the far end of the corridor, a pair of assistants were standing near a large set of glass conference doors. The moment they saw Hawthorne approaching, they straightened immediately. One of them spoke quietly into a small desk phone while the other opened the conference room doors in preparation. Inside the room, the long boardroom table stretched across the space like the center of a courtroom. Tall windows behind the chairs looked out over the skyline, and morning sunlight filled the room with a calm brightness that contrasted sharply with the tension already gathering among the board members seated inside. Several directors had arrived early and were reviewing reports or speaking quietly with one another. When Hawthorne stepped through the doorway, the conversation slowed. When Marcus Reed followed behind him, the room became noticeably quieter. Some of the board members had seen his name on the appointment documents earlier that week, but none of them had met him in person. Others had only heard fragments of his reputation from the operations division in Denver. A tall man with silver-rimmed glasses, sitting halfway down the table, leaned slightly toward the director beside him and whispered something while glancing toward Marcus. The whisper carried the familiar tone of quiet skepticism that Marcus had learned to recognize over many years. William Hawthorne moved toward the head of the table and rested one hand on the chair at the end. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for arriving early this morning. Several members of the board nodded politely while closing their folders. Hawthorne continued. Today marks an important transition for Hawthorne Dynamics. As you all know, we have spent many months evaluating candidates capable of guiding this company into its next chapter. His eyes move around the table slowly before he turns slightly toward Marcus Reed. I would like to introduce the man who will be leading that chapter. Marcus stepped forward with calm confidence, but without any dramatic gesture. He placed his briefcase beside the chair reserved for the chief executive officer and nodded respectfully to the room. Good morning, everyone. The response around the table was polite but cautious. A few directors nodded in return, while others studied him carefully, as if comparing the man standing before them with the expectations they had formed from reading reports. One of the directors near the far end finally spoke. That is understandable. The director leaned back in his chair. Hawthorne Dynamics is a complex organization with global operations. Many of us were surprised when the chairman recommended a candidate who has not spent the last decade inside a major executive office. A faint murmur moved through the room as several other directors listened closely. Marcus rested one hand lightly on the back of the chair before answering. I have spent the last decade inside factories, warehouses, and engineering teams where the real work of companies like this actually happens. The room grew still again. The director studied him for a moment. And you believe that experience prepares you to run a corporation this size? Marcus answered calmly. I believe understanding the people who build a company is the first requirement for leading one. William Hawthorne watched the exchange quietly without interrupting. Around the table, the board members began to shift in their seats. Some of them were still uncertain. Others were beginning to see something different in the calm confidence of the man standing before them. Marcus looked around the room once more and added one final sentence that carried the same quiet strength he had shown since the moment he walked through the company entrance earlier that morning. Leadership does not begin in the corner office. It begins where people decide whether they believe in the direction they are being asked to follow. The boardroom remained quiet for several seconds after Marcus Reed finished speaking. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows painted long lines across the polished table, reflecting softly against the glass walls. Several directors looked down at the documents in front of them, not because they needed to read them again, but because they were processing the confidence in Marcus' voice. The director with the silver-rimmed glasses leaned back in his chair and folded his hands slowly. His name was Daniel Carter, a man who had spent more than 20 years advising large corporations on financial strategy. He studied Marcus carefully before speaking again. "Your statement sounds admirable, Mr. Reed, but admiration does not run a global company. Results do." Marcus nodded once. "I agree completely." Carter tilted his head slightly. "Then perhaps you can explain something that concerns several members of this board." He opened a folder and slid a page forward along the table. Hawthorne Dynamics is currently managing manufacturing facilities in 8 states and international distribution centers across 2 continents. This company operates supply chains that move millions of dollars in materials every week. Some of us are wondering whether your experience preparing warehouse teams and factory divisions truly qualifies you to oversee that level of complexity. A quiet ripple of agreement moved among a few of the other directors. Marcus remained calm. He walked slowly to the chair at the end of the table, but did not sit yet. Instead, he rested one hand lightly against the polished wood surface and looked around the room. "The question you are asking is a fair one." Carter watched him closely. "Then answer it." Marcus nodded. "When I took over the Denver manufacturing division 3 years ago, that operation was losing money every quarter. Production delays were common. Employee turnover was higher than any other location in the company. Hawthorne Dynamics had already considered closing the facility. Principle." Marcus looked around the room once more. "The principle that the best strategy does not come from the top of the organization. It rises from the people who understand the work." Daniel Carter folded his arms again, but his expression had changed slightly. "You are proposing a leadership model that gives more influence to employees across the company." Marcus nodded. "I am proposing a leadership model that allows Hawthorne Dynamics to move faster than its competitors, because the people closest to the problems will also be the people trusted to solve them." William Hawthorne had been silent throughout the exchange, but now he leaned forward slightly in his chair. "That is the same philosophy that built this company in its earliest years." Marcus glanced toward him. "Then perhaps it is time we remembered it." Around the table, the directors looked at one another as the weight of that statement settled into the room. Some were still uncertain, but others were beginning to realize that the quiet man who had been stopped at the company entrance less than an hour earlier might be exactly the leader the company had been searching for. The quiet that followed Marcus Reed's words did not feel the same as the silence earlier in the meeting. This time, it was heavier, more thoughtful, like a room full of experienced people realizing that the conversation had shifted in a direction they had not predicted. Daniel Carter leaned back in his chair again, but his posture no longer carried the same confident challenge it had a few minutes earlier. He tapped his finger lightly against the edge of the folder in front of him while studying Marcus with a new level of curiosity. The man sitting at the head of the table did not look like the chief executives Carter had advised throughout his career. Those men usually spoke with rehearsed authority and carefully polished language. Marcus Reed spoke like someone who had learned leadership by solving problems rather than describing them. Linda Park glanced toward William Hawthorne before speaking again. "Mr. Reed, there is something else the board should understand before we move forward with this transition." Her voice was calm but deliberate. "Many of the senior managers across our regional offices do not yet know you personally. They will be asking the same question that some of us asked this morning. Marcus looked toward her. Which question is that? Linda folded her hands together. Why you? The words hung in the air for a moment. Marcus did not appear offended. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if he had expected the question all along. That is a reasonable question for anyone responsible for protecting a company this large. Daniel Carter leaned forward again. Then answer it clearly for the record. Him. Forward so the directors could see them. These are reports from the last 18 months of internal communication surveys within Hawthorne Dynamics. Linda Park leaned closer to read the heading on the page. Employee Engagement Report. Marcus continued speaking. The company has invested heavily in technology infrastructure and international logistics during the last several years. But these reports show a steady decline in employee confidence across multiple departments. Carter studied the document briefly. That trend is common during periods of rapid growth. Marcus nodded. It can be common, but ignoring it creates a hidden cost that eventually becomes larger than any financial report reveals. William Hawthorne watched quietly as Marcus continued. When communication breaks down inside a company, people stop sharing ideas that could improve the business. Small problems remain unsolved until they become expensive ones. Innovation slows because employees no longer believe their suggestions will matter. Marcus paused for a moment to let the board absorb the information. My first decision as Chief Executive Officer will not be a restructuring plan. It will be a listening initiative across every major division of this company. Carter looked slightly surprised. You intend to start by gathering opinions from employees. Marcus answered calmly. I intend to start by gathering solutions from the people who understand the work better than anyone else. A quiet murmur moved around the table. One director spoke up from the far end of the room. That approach might take time. Investors are not known for patience. Marcus met the man's gaze without hesitation. Investors ultimately care about long-term performance. If the culture inside this company becomes stronger, the financial results will follow naturally. Carter tapped the edge of the report thoughtfully. And you believe that approach will convince the markets that Hawthorne Dynamics is moving in the right direction? Marcus nodded once. Confidence in leadership begins inside the company before it spreads outside the company. Linda Park leaned back slightly in her chair. The room was beginning to feel different again. The skepticism that had greeted Marcus' arrival was slowly giving way to something closer to cautious respect. William Hawthorne finally spoke again with a quiet satisfaction in his voice. That is precisely the kind of thinking that convinced the board to choose you. Marcus closed the folder gently and placed his hands back on the table. Then we should begin as soon as possible. Carter looked around the room and noticed that several of the directors were nodding slowly. The man who had been questioned only minutes earlier was now guiding the direction of the conversation. And somewhere far below in the lobby, the guard who had stopped him at the door still had no idea that the quiet stranger he had challenged that morning was already beginning to lead the future of Hawthorne Dynamics. The discussion in the boardroom continued for more than an hour, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that every director could feel. The cautious skepticism that greeted Marcus Reed when he first entered the room had slowly been replaced by something quieter and far more important. Respect was beginning to take shape, not because Marcus demanded it, but because every answer he gave revealed the same steady clarity that had guided his work long before he sat in the chair of Chief Executive Officer. Daniel Carter eventually closed the last report on the table and leaned back in his chair. His voice carried a different tone now. It was no longer the voice of a man testing a candidate. It was the voice of someone acknowledging a leader. Mr. Reed, I believe the board has heard enough for this morning. Marcus looked toward him calmly. Carter continued speaking. You have made your philosophy clear, and you have answered every concern we raised. The next step is simple. The directors around the table exchanged brief glances with one another before several of them nodded quietly. Linda Park spoke next. The board has already voted on your appointment. Today was never about confirming that decision. It was about understanding the person who will guide the company forward. Marcus gave a respectful nod. I appreciate the opportunity. William Hawthorne stood slowly from his seat and looked around the table. Then, I believe we can move forward with the official transition. A small but meaningful moment followed as each director rose from their chair one after another. Some extended their hands to Marcus. Others offered short words of welcome or encouragement. None of them raised their voices. The gestures were simple, but they carried the weight of acceptance that had not existed when the meeting began. Daniel Carter stepped forward and shook Marcus' hand firmly. I will admit something honestly. When I read your name in the appointment documents, I expected to spend this morning questioning the board decision. Marcus smiled slightly. And now, Carter allowed himself a small smile in return. Now I believe the company may be in better hands than many of us expected. Linda Park approached next and spoke quietly. Leadership changes often create uncertainty inside organizations. Your challenge will be helping people believe in the direction you described today. Marcus answered calmly. Belief grows when people see their ideas shaping the future of their work. Park nodded thoughtfully before returning to her seat. Within minutes, the formal portion of the meeting had ended and the directors began gathering their papers. Outside the glass walls of the boardroom, assistants moved quietly through the hallway preparing the next series of executive briefings. William Hawthorne walked beside Marcus toward the windows overlooking the city. For a moment, both men stood silently while the skyline stretched across the morning horizon. Hawthorne spoke first. You handled that room exactly the way I hoped you would. Marcus looked down toward the busy streets far below. Most of them were not questioning my experience. They were questioning whether someone like me belonged in this position. Hawthorne did not deny it. That is true. Some people see leadership through a narrow lens shaped by decades of tradition. Marcus turned slightly toward him. Tradition changes when results prove something different is possible. Hawthorne nodded with quiet satisfaction. And that is why the board chose you. A soft knock came from the conference room door. An assistant stepped inside and spoke politely. Mr. Reed, the senior management team, has gathered in the executive hall. They are waiting for your introduction as Chief Executive Officer. Marcus picked up his briefcase and walked toward the door. As he stepped into the hallway, several senior managers stood waiting near the large conference area that overlooked the city. Many of them had heard only rumors about the man who would lead Hawthorne Dynamics. Now, they watched as Marcus Reed approached with calm confidence, the same quiet composure he carried when he first walked through the company entrance earlier that morning. Less than 2 hours had passed since security questioned whether he belonged inside the building. Now, he was about to address the entire leadership team of the company as the man responsible for guiding its future. The hallway outside the executive hall had filled with quiet anticipation by the time Marcus Reed arrived. Nearly 24 senior managers stood gathered near the wide glass wall that overlooked the city skyline. Some of them held tablets with meeting notes, while others spoke in low voices that quickly faded when they saw William Hawthorne walking beside the man who would soon become their new chief executive officer. Many of them had expected a dramatic entrance or a formal announcement. Instead, Marcus Reed approached with the same calm presence that had carried him through the morning from the moment he stepped through the company doors. Hawthorne paused at the front of the group and raised one hand slightly. The quiet conversations ended almost immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering on short notice. As you know, the board has completed its search for the next chief executive officer of Hawthorne Dynamics. He stepped aside and looked toward Marcus. I would like to introduce the person who will be guiding this company through its next chapter. Marcus stepped forward slowly and looked around the room. The managers studying him represented nearly every major division inside the organization. Operations leaders for manufacturing plants. Technology directors responsible for engineering teams. Financial officers who monitored global supply networks. Some of them watched him with curiosity. Others carried the cautious expressions of people who understood that leadership changes often meant new expectations. Marcus began speaking in a calm, steady voice. Thank you for taking the time to gather this morning. I know leadership transitions often create uncertainty. I want to begin by telling you something very simple. I am not here to replace the knowledge and experience that already exists inside this company. I'm here to work with it. A few of the managers exchanged quick glances. The tone of the introduction was not what many of them expected from a newly appointed chief executive officer. Marcus continued, "During the next several weeks, I will be visiting every major division of Hawthorne Dynamics. I will spend time in the facilities where our products are built and in the offices where our strategies are developed. My goal is not only to review reports, but to listen to the people who understand the details of our work better than anyone else." One of the operations directors stepped forward slightly. His name badge read Robert Delgado. "Mr. Reed, many of us have heard about the transformation you led in the Denver facility. Are you planning to apply the same approach here?" Marcus nodded once. "The same principle, yes. But every team inside this company has its own strengths and its own challenges. The solutions will come from the people who know those environments best." Robert Delgado considered the answer carefully before nodding in approval. That approach may bring some fresh energy to the organization. Marcus allowed a small smile. "That is the intention." William Hawthorne watched the exchange quietly. Several of the managers who had looked uncertain a few minutes earlier now appeared more relaxed. They were beginning to recognize something important about the man standing in front of them. He was not trying to impress them with grand promises or complicated strategies. He was speaking to them as partners in the future of the company. Marcus looked around the group again before adding one final thought. "I know that respect cannot be demanded by a title. It must be earned through actions that prove leadership is willing to stand beside the people doing the work." For a moment the room was silent again. Then Robert Delgado extended his hand. "Welcome to Hawthorne Dynamics, Mr. Reed." One by one, the other managers stepped forward to greet him as well. Some offered short words of encouragement. Others simply shook his hand with quiet approval. William Hawthorne watched the scene unfold with a faint sense of satisfaction. The transition had begun exactly the way he hoped it would. Not with a display of authority, but with the beginning of trust. And somewhere far below on the ground floor of the building, the memory of a simple moment still lingered. A guard had stopped a quiet man at the company entrance earlier that morning. That same man was now standing at the center of the leadership team, preparing to guide the entire company into its future. The executive hall slowly emptied as the senior managers returned to their departments, carrying with them the first impression of the man who would now guide the future of Hawthorne Dynamics. Marcus Reed remained near the tall glass windows for a moment after the last handshake ended. Below him, the city of Charlotte moved with the steady rhythm of a weekday morning. Traffic lights changed. People crossed the sidewalks. Delivery trucks rolled past office towers that looked almost small from this height. For a brief moment, Marcus allowed himself to breathe in the quiet of the view. William Hawthorne stepped beside him with his hands resting lightly behind his back. The chairman followed Marcus' gaze down toward the busy streets. "Do you know what I find interesting about this morning?" Marcus turned slightly. "What is that?" Hawthorne spoke calmly. "Less than 3 hours ago, you were standing in a lobby while security questioned whether you belonged in this building." Marcus gave a small, thoughtful nod. "I remember it clearly." Hawthorne continued, "And yet now every department head in the company is preparing to follow your direction." Marcus rested one hand lightly against the glass window and looked down at the entrance plaza far below. Leadership is not about convincing people with words alone. It is about giving them a reason to believe the direction is worth following. Hawthorne studied him quietly before speaking again. "That belief will grow quickly if the results match the vision you described." Marcus nodded. "That is the responsibility I accepted when the board made its decision." The two men stood in silence for another moment before Marcus finally turned toward the hallway. "I think it is time I returned to the ground floor." Hawthorne raised an eyebrow slightly. "Already?" Marcus smiled faintly. "The first people I should speak with today are not the directors or the investors. They're the people who welcomed me into the building this morning." Hawthorne understood immediately. That is a wise place to begin. Several minutes later, the elevator doors opened once again onto the main lobby. The atmosphere downstairs had returned to its normal rhythm. Employees moved across the marble floor carrying coffee cups and briefcases while conversations about projects and deadlines filled the open space. Behind the security desk, Carl Benson stood watching the entrance monitors with careful attention. The memory of the earlier encounter still lingered uncomfortably in his mind. When the elevator doors opened, he looked up automatically. The moment he saw Marcus Reed step out, his posture stiffened. Carl immediately stepped out from behind the desk. "Mr. Reed, I wanted to apologize again for the way I spoke to you earlier." Marcus walked toward him with the same calm expression he had shown throughout the morning. "There is no need for another apology. You were protecting the building." Carl hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I suppose I made an assumption about who you were." Marcus nodded slightly. "That happens more often than people realize." Carl looked down briefly, then back up. "Congratulations on becoming the new chief executive officer, sir." Marcus smiled warmly. "Thank you, Carl." Then he added something that made the guard straighten with quiet pride. "I hope you continue protecting this building with the same dedication you showed this morning." Carl nodded firmly. "Yes, sir." Marcus turned and walked toward the glass entrance doors. As he stepped outside, the morning sunlight spread across the plaza in front of the tower, the same place where he had paused earlier before walking inside. The difference now was not the building or the city around him. The difference was the understanding that had quietly changed within those walls. Some people had seen a stranger standing at the door that morning. But by the end of the day, they had begun to see the leader who would guide the future of Hawthorne Dynamics. And in the quiet reflection of the glass tower behind him, the truth of that moment lingered with simple clarity. They stopped him at the entrance because they thought he did not belong. But in the end, he was the one who belonged there the most.